Hey there, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating puzzle. What exactly does it take to supply biomass to Japan? The country has rolled out these incredibly rigorous feed-in tariff and feed-in premium schemes. We call them FIT and FIP for short, all to promote renewable energy. But here's the thing. They don't just take anyone's word that their fuel is actually green. Supplying this market means navigating a highly complex, globally spanning set of rules. And these rules? They're designed to track literally every single gram of carbon from a foreign field all the way to a Japanese power plant.
Okay, let's dive into this. Think of this as our travel itinerary for today. We'll start with supplying Japan's biomass market, then look at what fuels are actually eligible. After that, we'll break down the greenhouse gas calculation formula, compare default versus actual values, and finally look at how we're meeting those massive reduction targets.
All right, first stop, supplying Japan's biomass market.
To really understand this whole framework, we've got to look at the key players who are setting the rules. And at the heart of all this is one essential question. What makes biomass truly green for Japan? Well, the Japanese Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, decided that just assuming something is green, that's not going to cut it. They require rigorous quantitative proof. And this is exactly where the Green Gold Label, or GGL Foundation, steps in. They essentially provide the voluntary certification framework that evaluates and verifies this incredibly complex international supply chain. They make absolutely sure that any biomass delivered to the Japanese market fully complies with METI's super strict sustainability schemes. Because it's not just about the final product, right? It's about proving that the entire journey was green too.
Moving right along to Section 2, what fuels are eligible?
So, you might actually be surprised by how hyper-specific Japan's criteria are for what counts as acceptable biomass. Let's talk agricultural residues for a second. As of January 1, 2023, the list of eligible fuels expanded, and they included a really fascinating variety of sources. So sure, you've got your usual suspects like palm kernel shells, but now we're looking at the shells of coconuts, cashew nuts, walnuts, and get this, even peanut shells and pistachio shells. What I absolutely love about this is how it takes everyday, inedible agricultural byproducts and turns them into these highly regulated, incredibly valuable commodities for international energy markets.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. It's how the GGL scheme distinguishes between different types of woody biomass. On one hand, you have your standard processing residues. Think of stuff like offcuts, sawdust, bark from sawmills, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, if you're out there harvesting trees specifically for energy use, there is a very strict rule in place. The woody biomass must be derived from a final felling in an age of less than 20 years. And you can't just casually claim this either. It has to be confirmed by an official notification of felling. They are making absolutely sure that old-growth forests aren't being chopped down under the guise of green energy.
All right, Section 3, the GHG calculation formula.
So this is where we really start building out our travel itinerary. We're tracking the physical life cycle of, say, our peanut shell and measuring its associated carbon footprint along the way. Now, don't let the math freak you out. Just think of this formula like a giant expense report for a road trip, except the currency isn't dollars, it's greenhouse gases. Specifically, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. The total emissions, which is that big E right there, is literally just the sum of the emissions generated at each major stop along the journey. To be certified as green, this final E needs to be significantly lower than the reference value for whatever fossil fuel mix the biomass is replacing on the energy grid.
Let's break this down into a more logical, real-world sequence so you can see how it works. First up, we've got cultivation and extraction. This accounts for things like the fertilizer and the tractor fuel used to grow the crop. Second is processing, so the actual energy used to turn that raw shell into a usable fuel pellet. Third, transport and distribution. This is the footprint of moving the fuel across oceans and highways. And finally, generation, the emissions from the fuel when it's actually being used in the power plant. And here's the kicker. Every single participant in the supply chain has to pass their partial calculation on to the next person down the line. It forms this unbroken chain of data.
The thing you have to understand is that this expense report is brutally comprehensive. Take marine transport, for example. The calculation obviously has to account for the fuel consumption of the transport vessel. But wait, what happens when that giant ship sails back empty? Well, under the rules, if you don't have a specific voyage pattern recorded, you default to accounting for a 30% empty cargo return voyage. Or if it's a round trip from the same port, the transport of that empty cargo is fully recorded against your biomass fuel's carbon footprint. Unless, and this is a big unless, you can legally confirm the return vessel was unloaded to take on other cargo. Basically, every single drop of fuel burned out on the ocean counts against your final score.
Section 4. Default versus actual values. As you can probably imagine, calculating this massive international road trip means you need insanely strict data collection at every single stop. The framework basically gives you two paths for doing the math: default values or actual values. Disaggregated default values are essentially generic estimates, but here is the catch, and it's a big one. They can only be used if actual values are genuinely unavailable after you've made a maximum effort to find them. Plus, if you have to use a default value, the rules state it must be the most conservative, heavily penalized estimate out there. For instance, it might assume you used a high-emission natural gas boiler for processing. Using actual values, on the other hand, gives you an accurate and likely much lower carbon score. But that requires your emissions data to be meticulously recorded and transmitted through the entire chain of custody using transaction certificates. And honestly, for certain parts of the trip, you don't even get a choice. As the instruction document strictly dictates, you are legally obligated to use actual values for processing emissions and transport emissions. There's no relying on defaults here. And these actual values? They can't just be jotted down on some random spreadsheet. They have to be officially certified by independent bodies, according to the ISO 14065 standard. If at any point the emissions aren't recorded properly, calculating an actual value becomes literally impossible for everyone downstream, and that huge failure has to be clearly indicated on the delivery notes. It is a massive, massive logistical challenge.
Which brings us to Section 5, meeting the reduction targets.
So, why does all this meticulous, uncompromising calculating matter right now? Well, Japan has set some interlocking, rapidly approaching deadlines that are completely transforming the market. Just look at the aggressive scale-up of required greenhouse gas reductions. If a biomass power plant got approved under the FIT scheme from the 2022 fiscal year onwards, they are staring down two massive looming targets. By fiscal year 2029, their total life cycle greenhouse gas emissions must demonstrate a 50% reduction compared to the fossil fuel baseline. And then, just 1 year later, by fiscal year 2030, that requirement jumps to a staggering 70% reduction.
And this brilliantly illustrates the immense pressure supply chains are working against right this very second. For power plants approved on or after April 1, 2022, they did establish a critical grace period. But pay attention to the timeline. That grace period definitively closes on March 31, 2026. This window was given for one specific reason, so that every single participant in the supply chain, from the peanut farmers to the maritime shippers all the way to the power plants themselves, could scramble to acquire the necessary certifications and actually implement these new life cycle reduction criteria. The clock is loudly ticking on this one.
Which leaves us staring down this final imposing number, 70%. By 2030, the entire life cycle of Japan's imported biomass has to emit 70% less carbon than the grid's baseline. I mean, just think about what we've covered today. Verifying the exact age of harvested trees, tracking the return voyage of empty cargo ships, passing ISO-certified data across international borders. Achieving the 70% target isn't just going to take good intentions. It is going to require one of the most meticulously optimized, technologically advanced, and radically transparent supply chains the energy sector has ever seen. The rules are set in stone, so the real question now is, can the global market adapt in time?